I found out my ex-husband remarried from a wedding photo on Instagram while I was sitting alone in a cafe in Florence. The espresso had just been set down in front of me, a small white cup against a marble table barely wider than a dinner plate, when my phone buzzed. I remember the sunlight that afternoon, the way it spilled across the narrow street and warmed the terracotta walls, how ordinary everything felt. I had been in Italy for 3 weeks. 3 quiet, deliberate weeks. I told everyone I needed space. What I really needed was silence. When I opened the photo, I saw Richard standing in a navy suit I had once picked out for a charity gala in Boston. Next to him was Lena Collins, 39 years old, bright smile, ivory dress, hand resting confidently on his arm. The caption read, "Finally free. A new beginning." There were over 200 comments. "Congratulations. So happy for you. About time." I did not cry. I did not call. I did not even zoom in. I simply set the phone face down beside my saucer and lifted my espresso as if nothing had shifted beneath my feet. Around me, waiters moved between tables, tourists unfolded maps, someone laughed too loudly at a corner table. Life continued in inches and footsteps while 42 years of marriage condensed into a filtered square on a screen. People think I left because I was heartbroken. That I packed 2 suitcases, boarded a one-way flight from JFK, and fled to Europe like a woman trying to outrun humiliation. That is the version Richard has been telling. It sounds dramatic. It makes him look decisive. The truth is far less theatrical. I did not run. I withdrew. There is a difference. The last year of our marriage had been quieter than usual. Richard worked late. He changed cologne. He began answering simple questions with careful, polished sentences, as if I were a client instead of his wife. I noticed. Women who have managed households for 4 decades notice everything. The unopened mail. The shifted tone. The slight delay before a response. I never accused him. I never searched his phone. Dignity does not require surveillance. When I suggested we take some time, he agreed too quickly. That was my first confirmation. I told our son, Daniel, that I wanted to spend the summer in Florence. I said I'd always dreamed of seeing the Duomo at sunrise and walking along the Arno before the heat settled in. Daniel sounded relieved. "Maybe it's good to have a fresh start, Mom," he said. Fresh start. As if I were the one who needed reinvention. I leased a small furnished apartment overlooking a narrow cobblestone street. 800 square feet. Pale walls. A balcony just large enough for a wrought iron chair. Every morning, I opened the shutters and let the bells from the nearby church mark the hour. I cooked simple meals. Bread from the bakery downstairs. Tomatoes that actually tasted like summer. I allowed the quiet to stretch. What Richard did not understand, what Lena certainly did not understand, was that I had spent years preparing for contingencies he never imagined. Not revenge. Preparation. There is a difference. When you are married long enough, you learn your partner's strengths. You also learn his assumptions. Richard assumed I would cling to the house in Connecticut. He assumed I would fight loudly, cry publicly, demand explanations. He assumed that if he moved forward quickly enough, I would appear unstable in comparison. So when I saw that wedding photo, when I read, "Finally free," I felt something unexpected. Not rage. Not sorrow. Clarity. Because a man who rushes to remarry 3 weeks after his wife boards a plane is not starting a new life. He is trying to control the narrative of the old one. I finished my espresso. I left a few euros on the table. I walked back to my apartment past shop windows filled with leather bags and silk scarves, my reflection briefly visible in each pane of glass. 68 years old. White hair cut neatly at my shoulders. Posture straight. Expression steady. They thought I had crossed an ocean in defeat. That was their first mistake. I did not call anyone after I saw the wedding photo. I did not text Daniel. I did not write a single bitter sentence and delete it. Instead, I walked up the 3 flights of narrow stairs to my apartment, unlocked the heavy wooden door, and placed my phone on the small console table by the entrance as if it were nothing more than a set of keys. The apartment smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and warm stone. Outside, a scooter passed, its engine echoing against the old buildings. I stood still for a moment and listened to my own breathing. Slow. Even. I had learned years ago that the first reaction is rarely the most useful one. Richard had always been impulsive when he felt exposed. When business deals turned uncertain, he moved quickly to secure appearances. He liked momentum. He believed speed made him look confident. That was why the wedding did not surprise me. The timing did. 3 weeks was not romance. It was strategy. That evening, I opened my laptop at the small oak desk by the window and logged into the secure portal of Whitmore Holdings. I still held the majority voting shares. That fact had not changed when I boarded my flight at John F. Kennedy International Airport. It had not changed when Richard told friends that I needed to find myself. And it certainly had not changed because he put a ring on someone else's finger. 12 years earlier, after a minor health scare that frightened him more than he admitted, Richard had agreed to restructure the company. His attorney had framed it as smart estate planning. I had framed it as protection. 51% of controlling shares were transferred to a trust in my name. He signed without reading every page. He trusted me. Or perhaps he underestimated me. I did not access anything that night. I only reviewed. Numbers do not lie. Revenue projections. Debt ratios. Executive compensation. Everything appeared stable on the surface. Richard remained chief executive officer. Lena, according to the latest update, had recently been added as a consultant for public relations. That made me smile slightly. Public relations. Appearances. Always appearances. The next morning, I walked to a small market and bought fresh bread, olives, and a wedge of pecorino. I carried the paper bag tucked under my arm like any other woman enjoying a European summer. No one there knew that my husband of 4 decades had remarried before the ink on our separation agreement was dry. No one looked at me with pity. There is a certain relief in being anonymous. Back in Connecticut, neighbors would have been whispering already. They would have chosen sides without understanding the boardroom details that truly mattered. Around noon, my phone rang. Daniel. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice sounded careful. Mom, I was going to tell you. That was all he said at first. I leaned against the kitchen counter, looking at the light pooling on the tiled floor. Tell me what, Daniel? I asked calmly. Silence filled the space between us for a few seconds. Then he exhaled. Dad and Lena got married yesterday. It was small. Just a few people. I imagined him standing there, rehearsing explanations, trying to protect everyone at once. I saw, I replied. He seemed startled. You did? It was a lovely photograph, I said. I did not ask why he attended. I did not ask why he did not warn me. Questions would have invited apologies, and apologies would have softened him. I needed clarity, not comfort. Mom, maybe this is better, he said quietly. Better. I heard the word again. It echoed differently this time. Perhaps, I answered. After we hung up, I placed the phone on the counter and poured myself a glass of cold water. My hand did not shake. I was not competing with Lena. I was not competing with youth or optimism or curated smiles. I was evaluating risk. Richard believed that marrying quickly would stabilize his image. He believed it would reassure investors and silence speculation about why I had left. What he did not consider was that stability depends on structure, not ceremony. And I controlled the structure. 2 days after Daniel called, I received an email from our longtime family attorney, Martin Ellis. The subject line was simple: request for confirmation. I sat at the small desk by the window, the bells from the church tower marking 10 in the morning, and opened the message without urgency. Martin had been with Whitmore Holdings for over 20 years. He was not dramatic. He did not speculate. He verified. The email stated that Richard had requested a review of the current corporate structure, specifically the voting distribution attached to the primary trust. He wanted confirmation that no changes had been made during my time abroad. I read the sentence twice. No changes had been made. Not yet. I closed the laptop and leaned back in the wooden chair. It was not anger that moved me then. It was realization. Richard was not entirely confident. If he had been, he would not have asked for reassurance. He would have assumed control was secure. Instead, something about the wedding, or perhaps something Lena had said, had made him curious. Curious men begin to uncover their own mistakes. That afternoon, I walked along the Arno River, watching the water slide beneath the old bridges. Couples leaned against the railing, tourists lifted cameras, vendors arranged scarves in careful rows. I thought about the early years of my marriage. Richard and I had started with very little. A small 2-bedroom house in Connecticut. One used sedan. I handled the books while he traveled for meetings. I learned the language of contracts, margins, and leverage not because I wanted power, but because someone had to understand what we were building. When Whitmore Holdings began to grow, investors complimented Richard on his vision. They rarely asked who reviewed the spreadsheets late at night at the kitchen table. I did not mind. I was never interested in applause. I was interested in stability. That stability now rested on a legal detail he had forgotten. When I returned to the apartment, I called Martin. He answered on the second ring. "Margaret," he said, his tone measured. "I assume you saw the inquiry." "I did," I replied. "Has there been any modification to the trust?" he asked. "No," I said truthfully. "However, I would like to review the discretionary clauses regarding executive removal." There was a brief pause on the line. Not surprise. Respect. "Of course," he said. "As majority trustee, you have that authority." Authority. The word felt steady in my hand, like a well-balanced glass. I did not ask Martin about the wedding. I did not mention Lena. Personal humiliation is loud. Structural leverage is quiet. Prepare a full performance summary for the last fiscal quarter, I added. And outline the procedural steps required to call a special board meeting. Martin cleared his throat softly. Understood. May I ask if this is precautionary? Everything is precautionary, I answered. After we ended the call, I stood by the open window and listened to the sounds drifting up from the street below. Somewhere in Connecticut, Richard was likely reviewing documents, perhaps confident that nothing substantial had changed. Lena might have been advising him on optics, suggesting charitable appearances or interviews that framed their union as hopeful and modern. They would assume I was grieving privately in Europe, adjusting to solitude, relearning how to sleep in a bed alone. They would assume my silence meant surrender. Silence, however, is not absence. It is space. And space allows clarity. I opened my laptop once more and began reading the trust agreement from the beginning, every clause, every footnote. The removal provision required a majority vote from the controlling shares. I held 51%. The board could be convened within 14 days of formal notice. No scandal. No spectacle. Just procedure. I closed the document and folded my hands on the desk. Richard believed he had rewritten his life with a ceremony. He had forgotten that I had written the structure beneath it. And structures do not shift because of photographs. The following morning, I did not rush to send instructions. Power that moves too quickly becomes emotional. I have never been emotional with business. I woke before 7, opened the shutters, and let the early light settle across the small living room. The street below was quiet except for a delivery truck unloading crates of produce. I made coffee slowly, measuring each scoop, listening to the steady drip into the glass pot. 42 years of marriage do not disappear because a man signs a new license at City Hall. They become data. Patterns. Decisions made and unmade. I sat at the desk and reviewed the executive performance summary Martin had sent overnight. Revenue was steady, but expenses had increased in the last 2 quarters. Marketing expenditures were unusually high. Public relations contracts. Event sponsorships. Image management. I did not need to ask who had suggested that shift. Lena's background was in brand consulting. She understood presentation. She did not yet understand infrastructure. I thought back to the early days when Richard and I could not afford image management. We managed cash flow in a spiral notebook. I balanced accounts at the kitchen table while Daniel colored beside me with crayons. When Richard secured his first major contract, we celebrated with takeout pizza and paper plates. No photographers. No captions. Just relief. I remembered the year he insisted on expanding too quickly. He wanted to lease a larger office in Stamford, nearly 3,000 square feet, far more than we needed. I ran projections and showed him the risk. He accused me of being cautious. I accused him of being optimistic without foundation. We compromised. We grew gradually. That was our rhythm. He pushed. I anchored. Somewhere along the way, he began to believe the momentum was his alone. Perhaps I allowed that illusion because it kept peace at home. Peace, however, is not the same as security. At 10:30 Eastern Time, which was 4:30 in the afternoon in Florence, Martin called again. I have outlined the procedure for convening a special board meeting, he said. 14 days notice. Written communication to all directors. Agenda limited to executive performance review and potential restructuring. Draft the notice, I replied. But do not send it yet. There was another small pause. Understood. I closed the laptop and stepped onto the narrow balcony. A warm breeze moved through the street, carrying the scent of baked bread and distant exhaust. I rested my hands on the iron railing and allowed myself one honest thought: Richard would be shocked. Not wounded. Not betrayed. Shocked. He had always believed I would protect him, even from himself. That belief had shaped his confidence. It had also shaped his carelessness. My phone vibrated with a message from Daniel. A simple question. Are you okay? I looked at the words for a long moment. He was not asking about the company. He was asking about his mother. I typed slowly. I am well. I hope you are. It was neither cold nor warm. It was accurate. I set the phone aside and returned inside. The removal clause required a majority vote from controlling shares. I held that majority. The board respected results. If I presented the rising expenses, the strategic drift, the concentration of influence in someone with no equity stake, they would listen. This would not be about marriage. It would be about stewardship. I opened the trust agreement again and reread the final section, the one Richard had skimmed 12 years earlier. It stated clearly that the trustee retained ultimate authority to act in the best interest of the corporation and its shareholders. Best interest. Not emotional interest. Not romantic interest. I folded the document carefully and placed it back in its digital folder. Richard believed he had rewritten our story with a ceremony and a photograph. What he did not realize was that I had been revising the ending long before he chose a new beginning. 3 days later, I instructed Martin to send the notice. There was no ceremony attached to the decision. No dramatic declaration. I was standing in the narrow kitchen, rinsing a coffee cup under warm water, when I said the words. Send it. That was all. The special board meeting would be scheduled 14 days from delivery of the notice, held at the Stamford headquarters. Executive performance review and potential restructuring. Clean language. Neutral tone. I dried the cup with a white linen towel and placed it back on the shelf. Outside, the afternoon sun settled across the terracotta rooftops, and a church bell marked the half hour. In Connecticut, it was still morning. I imagined the email landing in Richard's inbox, the subject line formal and unremarkable. He would open it expecting routine documentation. He would read the first paragraph twice. He would scroll down to confirm the agenda. And then, perhaps for the first time in months, he would feel uncertainty that did not come from gossip or public opinion, but from structure. My phone rang less than an hour later. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Margaret, he said, his voice controlled but thinner than usual. What is this about? I walked to the balcony and looked down at the cobblestones below, a florist arranging white hydrangeas in metal buckets. It is about governance, I replied evenly. The board deserves a review of executive performance. Performance, he repeated. The company is stable. Stable is not the same as strategic, I said. There was a pause. I could hear him breathing. Is this about the wedding? He asked finally. I almost smiled. He needed it to be personal. Personal is easier to dismiss. This is about fiduciary responsibility, I answered. Nothing more. He exhaled slowly. You left, he said. You said you wanted distance. Distance does not revoke ownership, I replied. The line went quiet. In that silence, I could feel the shift. Not anger. Recognition. He understood now that I had not disappeared. I had repositioned. Lena thinks this looks hostile, he said carefully. There it was. Lena. Already advising. Already framing. It is not hostile, I said. It is procedural. We just got married, he continued. The optics are not assets, I interrupted softly. Revenue, governance, shareholder confidence. Those are assets. He did not respond. For decades, I had moderated my tone to avoid bruising his pride. I had softened data with reassurance. That instinct no longer served either of us. Richard, I said calmly, this meeting will happen. You may prepare your presentation accordingly. I ended the call before he could redirect the conversation. I did not tremble afterward. I did not pace. I returned inside and opened my laptop. Within an hour, 2 board members had replied to confirm attendance. One added a brief note expressing appreciation for proactive oversight in light of recent public developments. Public developments. The wedding had traveled further than Richard realized. Image management is expensive because perception spreads faster than numbers. That evening, Daniel called again. His voice carried a tension he was trying to conceal. Dad said there is a board meeting, he began. Yes, I replied. Mom, this is going to cause problems. I leaned back in the chair and looked at the fading light beyond the window. Problems reveal structure, I said. If the structure is sound, it will hold. He was silent for a moment. Lena feels like you are attacking them. I chose my words carefully. I am not attacking anyone. I am exercising my responsibility. Responsibility is a quiet word. It does not trend on social media. It does not come with captions. It does not require applause. But it moves markets. After we ended the call, I folded my hands on the desk and allowed myself one steady breath. Richard had believed marriage would consolidate his authority. Instead, it had accelerated review. He mistook ceremony for security. He forgot that security rests with the person who understands the foundation. And I have always understood the foundation. The notice was delivered on a Monday morning in Connecticut, which meant it arrived just after lunch in Florence. I did not check my phone immediately. I walked instead to the open-air market near Piazza Santo Spirito and bought a small basket of strawberries and a bottle of mineral water. I listened to vendors call out prices in steady rhythms and watched an elderly couple argue gently over which peaches were sweeter. Life continued in ordinary measures while something far less visible began to shift across an ocean. When I returned to my apartment, there were 6 emails waiting. 3 confirmations from board members. 1 inquiry from the chief financial officer asking for clarification on the performance metrics to be reviewed. 1 short message from Martin stating that formal acknowledgement had been received from Richard. And 1 message from Richard himself. I opened his last. It was brief. We need to discuss this privately before the meeting. No greeting. No signature. I read it once and closed the screen. Private discussions are often attempts to contain public accountability. For decades, I had been the person he processed decisions with behind closed doors. I had absorbed his doubt, reshaped his proposals, softened his miscalculations before they reached the board. He wanted that insulation again. He would not have it. That evening, the phone rang. I answered without delay. "Margaret," he began, his tone measured but strained. "This meeting is unnecessary." "The board does not agree," I replied calmly. "You have not even heard my argument," he said. "You may present it in 14 days, I answered. Silence stretched between us. I could almost picture him standing in his office, one hand pressed to his desk, the other holding the phone too tightly. "Is this retaliation?" he asked finally. The word hovered there, hopeful. Retaliation would imply emotion. Emotion would imply instability. "No," I said. "It is evaluation." He exhaled sharply. "You are making this personal." "If it were personal," I said softly, "you would know." I ended the call before he could redirect the narrative again. I did not feel triumphant. I felt focused. The next morning, Martin sent a detailed briefing on recent executive decisions. Marketing expenses had increased by 22% over 2 quarters. A new consulting agreement had been drafted granting discretionary influence over brand strategy to Lena Collins. No equity attached. No performance benchmarks clearly defined. Optics, not outcomes. I highlighted 3 sections and forwarded the document back to Martin with 1 sentence: prepare comparative projections with and without current discretionary spending. Within hours, the response arrived. The difference was measurable. Cash reserves would tighten within 12 months if the current trajectory continued. Not catastrophic. Not yet. But drift becomes decline when left unchecked. Late that afternoon, Daniel called again. His voice was more direct this time. "Dad is worried," he said. "He thinks you are trying to remove him." I stood by the window, watching laundry sway between 2 buildings across the narrow street. "I am reviewing performance," I replied. "That is my responsibility." "Lena says this is humiliating," he added quietly. I allowed myself a slow breath. Humiliation comes from exposure, Daniel. Not from procedure. He did not answer immediately. I imagined him caught between loyalty and discomfort, wanting peace without understanding cost. "Mom," he said finally, "this could change everything." I looked around the small apartment, at the worn wooden table, the open shutters, the pale afternoon light. Everything had already changed. "Yes," I said gently. "It could." After the call ended, I opened the trust agreement once more and reviewed the voting sequence required to enact executive removal if warranted. 51%. Documented cause. Majority approval. No theatrics. No raised voices. Just signatures. Richard had believed that by marrying quickly he could secure perception. He forgot that perception does not sign documents. I do. And in 14 days, the board would remember who holds the foundation. The week before the board meeting moved with a strange stillness, as if time itself were holding its breath. In Florence, the mornings were still bright and measured. I kept my routine unchanged. Coffee at 7. A short walk along the river. 30 minutes reviewing documents at the desk by the window. Stability in small things sharpens clarity in large ones. Martin sent the finalized agenda and supporting materials to all board members 3 days prior to the meeting. Revenue charts. Expense comparisons. Projected cash flow under current discretionary allocations. Nothing inflammatory. Just numbers aligned in orderly columns. Richard did not call again after our last conversation. That told me more than any argument would have. Silence from him was never surrender. It was calculation. He was preparing. Perhaps he was rehearsing a narrative about innovation, about modernizing the brand, about strategic reinvention. Perhaps Lena was helping him shape it into something compelling and optimistic. I did not resent her. Resentment is inefficient. I considered her a variable. A recent addition without equity but with influence. Influence without ownership is persuasive until it meets accountability. 2 days before the meeting, I received a formal presentation deck from Richard's office. 27 slides outlining growth opportunities, expanded media presence, and a vision for repositioning Whitmore Holdings as a more contemporary entity. The language was polished. The photography was bright. It was, in many ways, impressive. But it did not address the expense ratio. It did not address the compression of reserves. It did not address the absence of measurable benchmarks attached to new contracts. I read through it carefully, highlighting nothing, reacting to nothing. Data does not respond to optimism. It responds to discipline. That evening, Daniel called again. His voice was quieter than usual. Dad is under a lot of pressure, he said. He feels blindsided. I stood at the small stove stirring a simple tomato sauce, the scent filling the apartment. He received 14 days' notice, I replied gently. That is not blindness. That is governance. Lena thinks you are trying to embarrass him, Daniel added. I let the spoon rest against the side of the pot. Public embarrassment requires spectacle, I said. This is a board meeting. He was silent for a long moment. Are you going to remove him? He asked finally. The question hung between us like a weight neither of us wanted to name. The board will evaluate performance, I answered. That is all. After we ended the call, I turned off the stove and set the table for one. A single plate. A single glass of water. For years, I had set places for 3. Marriage adjusts your habits until they feel permanent. Then one day, they become optional. The night before the meeting, I did not sleep poorly. I reviewed the removal clause once more, not because I doubted it, but because familiarity strengthens resolve. 51% controlling interest. Documented performance review. Majority vote. Procedure protects everyone involved. In Connecticut, it would be 8 in the morning when the meeting convened. In Florence, it would be 2 in the afternoon. I arranged my laptop on the desk and tested the secure video connection. The screen reflected my image briefly before the login window appeared. 68 years old. Shoulders straight. Expression calm. Richard believed the ceremony had secured his future. He believed the ring and the photograph signaled stability. What he had not accounted for was the quiet authority of structure. Tomorrow, there would be no raised voices, no personal accusations. Only charts. Only votes. Only the foundation speaking for itself. And foundations, when properly built, do not bend to optics. At exactly 2 in the afternoon in Florence, which was 8 in the morning in Connecticut, the board meeting began. I sat at the small wooden desk by the window, the shutters open, light spilling across the keyboard. The secure video platform connected one square at a time. Martin appeared first, composed as always. Then the chief financial officer. Then two independent directors. Finally, Richard's image filled the center of the screen. He was seated in the Stamford conference room, the long polished table visible behind him. He wore a dark suit and a pale blue tie. He looked prepared. He did not look relaxed. Lena was not visible. But I suspected she was somewhere nearby, just outside the frame. Meetings begin with formalities. Roll call. Confirmation of quorum. Approval of agenda. No one mentioned the wedding. No one mentioned Europe. The company existed independently of our marriage, and today it would be treated that way. Richard began his presentation with confidence. He spoke about modernization, brand evolution, expanded digital reach. His slides were sleek. His tone was steady. He framed recent expenditures as investments in future relevance. I listened without interruption. When he finished, Martin turned to me. "Margaret, as majority trustee, would you like to present your review?" The phrase was deliberate. Majority trustee. I nodded and shared my screen. The first slide displayed revenue trends over the last 4 quarters. Stable. The second displayed operating expenses. Rising. The third displayed marketing and public relations allocations. 22% increase over 2 quarters. I did not accuse. I did not dramatize. I asked questions. Can you clarify the performance metrics attached to the new consulting agreement? I said evenly. Richard shifted slightly in his chair. The metrics are qualitative at this stage, he replied. Brand repositioning requires flexibility. I moved to the next slide. Cash reserve projections under current spending. 12-month compression. Flexibility should not compromise liquidity, I said calmly. One of the independent directors leaned forward. Are there measurable return indicators tied to these expenditures? He asked. Richard paused. We are in the early phase, he answered. Silence followed. Not hostile. Analytical. I felt no surge of triumph. Only precision. I advanced to the final section. Governance structure. Concentration of influence in a non-equity consultant. Absence of board review prior to contract execution. The concern is not innovation, I said. The concern is oversight. The chief financial officer cleared his throat. There was limited board visibility on certain allocations, he admitted carefully. Richard's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. We needed to move quickly, he said. The market is competitive. Speed does not replace process, I replied. The words were not sharp. They were factual. Martin then addressed the board. Given the data presented, the trustees must consider whether current executive leadership aligns with fiduciary obligations to shareholders. The phrase hung in the air. Fiduciary obligations. Not marriage. Not pride. Obligation. One director spoke first. I recommend a formal vote on executive restructuring. Another agreed. Richard looked directly into the camera then. 4A. Brief moment, the confidence I had known for decades flickered into something else. Not anger. Not pleading. Recognition. He understood that this was not about punishment. It was about alignment. Martin initiated the vote. Each director stated their position clearly. When it was my turn, I spoke without hesitation. In the best interest of Whitmore Holdings and its shareholders, I vote in favor of restructuring executive leadership effective immediately. The final count was recorded. Majority achieved. Richard was removed as Chief Executive Officer pending transitional review. There were no raised voices. No accusations. Only minutes documented and signatures prepared. The meeting adjourned within 90 minutes. The screen went dark. The apartment fell quiet again. Outside, a scooter passed. Somewhere in Stamford, Richard was still seated at that long polished table. He had believed that a ceremony secured his authority. Today, the foundation answered instead. And foundations, when tested, reveal exactly who built them. After the screen went dark, I remained seated at the small wooden desk for several minutes, my hands resting lightly on either side of the laptop. Outside, the bells rang again, marking the hour as if nothing of consequence had occurred. In Connecticut, Richard would still be in that conference room, perhaps standing now, perhaps sitting very still. The board members would be gathering their folders, speaking in low professional tones about transition plans and interim leadership. There would be no shouting. No dramatic exits. Just structure recalibrating itself. I closed the laptop gently and stood, walking to the balcony. The afternoon air was warm, carrying the faint scent of espresso from the cafe below. I watched a young couple cross the narrow street, their conversation animated and unaware of the shift that had just taken place across an ocean. I did not feel victorious. Victory suggests competition. This was correction. An hour later, my phone rang. Richard's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring once before answering. "Margaret," he said, and for the first time in decades, his voice carried no performance. "You could have handled this differently." I leaned against the balcony railing, the iron cool beneath my palm. "I handled it through the board," I replied evenly. "That is how leadership transitions are handled." He was quiet for a moment. "You removed me," he said finally. "Not accusing. Simply stating fact." "The board voted," I corrected gently. "You initiated it," he said. I did not deny that. "I fulfilled my responsibility as trustee," I answered. Silence stretched between us again, but it was no longer tense. It was reflective. "Lena feels blindsided," he added. There it was again. Lena. I looked down at the cobblestones below, at a delivery truck reversing slowly into a narrow space. "She was not appointed by the board," I said calmly. "She was appointed by you." He exhaled slowly. "You have always been steady," he said, almost to himself. I did not respond to the compliment. It was not new. It was simply acknowledged too late. "What happens now?" he asked. The question surprised me. For years, he had asked what we should do next as partners. Now he asked alone. "An interim chief executive officer will be appointed within the week," I said. "You may remain as a non-executive advisor if the board approves. The decision will depend on performance review outcomes." There was no anger in my voice. No satisfaction. Only clarity. "You are still in Florence," he said after a moment. "Yes," I replied. "Are you coming back?" I looked at the skyline of tiled roofs and distant hills. "Not yet," I said. "The company does not require my physical presence. It requires oversight." He was silent again. "I thought marrying Lena would stabilize things," he admitted quietly. "Marriage does not stabilize governance," I said. "Structure does." We ended the call without hostility. When I went back inside, I poured a glass of water and sat at the small table set for one. For the first time since arriving in Florence, I allowed myself to feel something softer than strategy. Not regret. Not resentment. Release. I had not crossed the Atlantic to escape humiliation. I had stepped back to observe the architecture of a life I had helped build. Richard believed that a ceremony and a photograph could rewrite history. He believed perception could outrun foundation. Today, foundation answered. I did not need revenge. I needed alignment. An alignment, when quietly restored, changes everything without raising its voice.